Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the dinner table with your favorite cousin, Kinda G. Now, what, 1 week into the new year, y'all better be sticking to your New Year's resolutions. And if you don't have any goals for this new year, you're wrong. Because Cousin Kinda is on it. We smashing all goals this year, I promise you that. But I just have one question for y'all cousins. Have you ever been alone in your house, having a good old time, minding your own business, and you just get this strange feeling that somebody's watching you? Well, that same strange feeling is the exact feeling that a lot of these victims in today's case felt. And from August 1992 to March 2003, for a good 11 long years, someone was wreaking havoc all over Louisiana, mainly in Baton Rouge. And this led to the rapes and murders of several women for years. But unfortunately, the killer was able to carry on for so long because, like many of the cases we've discussed here at the dinner table, the crimes weren't being connected. And on top of that, they were profiling the wrong type of person. And whoever was committing these crimes to these independent, intelligent, educated women was clearly filled with anger and rage. And cousins, I already know y'all are ready to hear about the man who was dubbed the Baton Rouge serial killer. So sit on down, get comfortable, get your wine, your popcorn, and let's dive in.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
On August 22nd, 1992, a 41-year-old woman by the name of Connie Warner was living in the nice suburban neighborhood of Oak Shadows in Zachary, Louisiana. She was a successful accountant, loving mother, and she lived with her daughter Tracy. But on this day, on August 22nd, 1992, she was reported missing. And when the police reported to her home to investigate, they found her home in disarray. And it appeared to them that a struggle had clearly taken place. They found blood stains in the floors of numerous rooms in her home. And from the looks of it, her washer and dryer had been moved from their initial placement as if she had been holding on for dear life, trying not to get out of the house. But she had been assaulted and dragged from her home. And one of the biggest pieces of evidence was that her car, despite being parked neatly in her driveway, the police also found vomit inside of the car belonging to Connie. So they assumed that the suspect dragged Connie from her home, placed her inside of her car, where she eventually vomited from the stress and from whatever was going on to her. And then they believed the killer used her car to drive her away from her home, killed her, dumped her body, then drove her car back to her house, parked it, and then just simply walked away. Connie's body wasn't found until 2 weeks later off of Pittsburgh Ave near Capitol Lake in Baton Rouge. And by then, her body was already heavily decomposed. But despite all of the decomposition, the investigators could tell that she had been severely beaten, and her cause of death was a skull fracture. And unfortunately, being that she had been out in nature for about 2 weeks now, they weren't able to find any sort of evidence on her body or in the surrounding area. Because you see, during the time her body had been thrown out near a lake, Hurricane Andrew had just blown in on Louisiana on August 26, 1992. And the hurricane destroyed a lot of evidence that could have possibly been discovered to help solve Connie's murder. But to make things even worse, her daughter says that Connie had reported a peeping Tom a week before she disappeared. But Connie's would be the first of many attacks in Louisiana, because on August 4th, 1993, just 8 months later, 2 teenagers were hanging out in a cemetery behind Oak Shadow subdivisions. You know, they were trying to get their little freak on, they were trying to have some alone time, and unbeknownst to them, right in the middle of them doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing in the backseat of this car, somebody had clearly been watching them all night. So as they're making out, getting hot and heavy, a man crept up on their car and attacked them using a harvesting tool. And this tool was described to be like a long cane, knife, almost like a sword or a machete. And Thankfully, this couple survived because literally in the middle of them being attacked, a police officer driving by seen the attack. He seen a man just hacking away at the teenagers. So as he started to pursue him, the man took off running. But luckily, the teenager Michelle Chapman, who was attacked that night, was able to describe the man who had attacked them. She tells the police that the man that attacked her and her boyfriend had a round face. He was African American with short hair, a large forehead, thin eyebrows, and a thin pencil mustache. And luckily for them, one of the investigators working this case was a police chief by the name of David McDavid. And based off of the attack, Detective McDavid was already looking into a man with a peeping Tom history and a very questionable past. And this man was none other than Derek Todd Lee. Derek Todd Lee was born November 5th, 1968 in St. Francisville, Louisiana, to a 17-year-old mother by the name of Frances Lee and father Samuel Roth. The two of them would go on to have another child together. And like a lot of serial killers that we talk about here at the dinner table, he was said to be abused as a child. And it's said that his dad Samuel was really unstable. And from a very young age, he wasn't in Derek's life. And it's said by family members that he had a couple of mental health issues like bipolar and psychosis, and these could have possibly passed down to Derek. And it was said that Samuel's disorders got so bad that he had to be sent away. So he was gone for a good portion of Derek's early life. And because of that, he never really knew his dad growing up. And it wasn't until he was around 21 when they were reunited. And it wasn't long after they were reunited that his dad was arrested in 1991 for the attempted manslaughter of his ex-wife. And for this, he was institutionalized. So there you have it for his dad. Now his mom, on the other hand, was described as quite the domineering woman. Very aggressive, bossy. She was just very arrogant. But she would go on to remarry a man by the name of Coleman Barrow. And Derek's relationship with his stepfather were reported in many different ways, because some sources say that Coleman was a very hard worker, he cared for Florence and her children, and he treated them like they were his own. Some accounts would even go on to say that his stepfather and Florence were very religious and they raised their children to be very good people. And although some reports claim that Coleman and Derek had a really good relationship, others say the exact opposite. They say that Coleman was abusive towards Derek and his siblings, and they say that the step-parent-stepchild relationship was very strained throughout Derek's life. Now, despite all of the contradicting reports between Derek and his stepdad, all sources did agree that Derek had a really good extended family. They were close, they were supportive, and for the most part, he had a really good, happy environment growing up. You see, he grew up in a small settlement of independence just outside of St. Francisville in an area that locals called Lee's Quarters. And Lee's Quarters were on Blockmore Lane. That consisted of low-budget homes and trailers. But inside of this community, Derek was surrounded by his aunts, his uncles, all of his cousins. And his sister would go on to account that they were all really close-knit. They were loving. This was like a family community. And it was also reported that along with the siblings that Derek and his parents had, when his mom remarried to his stepdad, combined, they had 13 kids and a bunch of cousins all living nearby. But let's not forget, this is Louisiana, and where he grew up, there was still a lot of segregation. And he grew up in a world where people with money, they had power, and of course the color of their skin mattered. So they were allowed to go certain places and do certain things that Derek and his friends and family weren't allowed to do. And this caused for a lot of harbored resentment within him. But back in school, Derek was slower than a lot of kids his age. And it was really hard for him to catch on to the concepts that were being taught in school, so he was teased. It was even said that he had an IQ below 75, and he would suck his thumb in class, and he would call his female teachers mama. But he was self-described as a loner by the age of 9, and he was reported to have the tendency to stand outside of the females' restroom and just watch while they were undressed. But his little act of peeping wasn't a secret to anybody. because most of his family knew what was going on. Because not only was he standing outside of the girls' locker room in school trying to catch a look, he was also peeping on all of his girl cousins too. They just figured he would grow out of it and, would stop. But because Derek's little peeping Tom behavior, it went unchecked, so it continued to escalate. So on November 8th of 1981, just 3 days after his 13th birthday, Derek was arrested for stealing and vandalizing a local candy store. And y'all get this, because on this same day he was arrested, he also attacked a woman right in front of his mom because she accused him of peeping on her. So, he was arrested for burglary, vandalism, and assault, and he was only 13. So, for the robbery and vandalism, he pled guilty and he was put on probation. But he received nothing for being a first-time offender as a peeping Tom. But it definitely wouldn't be his last. Peeping at his cousins just wasn't enough anymore. So he started to wander off into the St. Francisville surrounding areas, peeping into women's windows, watching them undress, and they had no idea. But at this time, he was a teenager, and just like when he was a young boy, none of these violations were ever taken seriously or even reported. But on August 8th, 1985, when he was 16 years old, he was arrested for attempted second-degree murder. Because while he was in school, he pulled a knife on another student. And for this attack, he was charged with the attempt to kill. But authorities didn't have anything to hold him on, so they had to let him go. And that same year in 1985, he set his own car on fire in order to collect insurance money. 17 years old trying to commit insurance fraud? That's wild. I didn't even know about insurance fraud until I was well into my 20s, so 17 is crazy. But shortly after this, he dropped out of school in the 11th grade. And like Alton Coleman and Lonnie Franklin that we've already discussed here at the dinner table, Lee was a bit of a charmer and a ladies' man. So he started to develop a little charisma, a little confidence about himself. And after dropping out of high school, he sparked up a little relationship with a woman named Jacqueline Denise Sims. She fell for his little charm, and they were head over heels for one another. So it wasn't long before the two of them tied the knot in September of 1988. They would go on to have 2 children together, and by the spring of the following year, Miss Jacqueline was already filing charges against Derek for domestic abuse and threatening to kill her and her dad with a gun. So early on in their relationship, Jacqueline could tell that Buddy wasn't wrapped too tight. But from the outside looking in, everybody was looking at their relationship and things looked great. They appeared to be a loving, happy couple, and Derek just seemed to be settling into this married life and fatherhood as well, because he and Jackie would go on to have 3 kids together. Derek Todd Lee Jr. in 1992, a daughter, Doris Lee, and their third child, Derek Lee, in 1999. And surprisingly enough, for those who did see him as a father, they reported that he was a good father. He provided for his family, they were happy, and he was a family man. Eventually, he would go on to move him and his family to Zachary, Louisiana. There, he worked several blue-collar jobs, including being a pipe filter and a concrete layer. But employment records did report that Derek had a hard time keeping a job, so he was always having money problems. Not only that, but he spent a lot of his time at the local bars getting drunk, cheating, and just doing his wife bad. But when it comes to his wife Jackie's dad, it was said that he was actually killed in an explosion at a plant near Baton Rouge in 1996. So for the death of her father, Jacqueline received $250,000 in a wrongful death lawsuit. But her man Derek took full advantage of her dad's money. And he started spending this money like he had won the lotto himself. This man wanted to look like money. He was trying to impress all the women he was seeing out at these bars. He was buying chains, new clothes, fancy cars, you name it. But his personal life and his marriage was still in shambles. He was spending all of his wife's money. He didn't have a job. His wife was about to leave him. He was spiraling out of control, and he didn't know where to turn. But for the next few years, his anger and rage and this sense to be in control just continued to build up. And not only that, but he continued his peeping ways. And in 1988, A call came to the police department reporting a man standing in a kiddie pool, peeping through a woman's window. And surprisingly enough, this was the exact same neighborhood that Connie lived in before she reported being peeped on, then being attacked, kidnapped, and murdered. So, knowing Derek's background, Detective McDavid just instinctively suspected Derek of being the peeping Tom in the neighborhood and the person that murdered Connie Warner. But because they never found any evidence to bring charges against him, or anybody for that matter, Connie's murder would never be solved. And it wasn't until April of 1998 when Derek kicked it into a whole nother gear with his attacks. So, on this day, on April 18th in 1998, a 3-year-old child was found wandering outside of his home alone. And again, this was in the Shadow Oaks neighborhood. So, when the neighbor found the child, she knew who the baby belonged to. So the neighbor immediately grabs the baby and tries to take him home. But when they get to the apartment, the child's mom, 28-year-old Randy Mubiral, was nowhere to be found. But upon glancing around the house, the neighbor sees that it's in disarray. There's blood in several areas of the home, and she immediately calls the police. When they get there, they start their investigation right away. And they too find blood around Randy's home. In her bedroom, they find bloody clumps of hair. They also find one of her contact lenses sitting in a patch of blood on her carpet. And then they find bloody drag marks. So her carpet was really telling it all. And they also took note that her car had been recently moved and that her keys were missing. And guess who was called to take over this case? None other than Detective McDavid. And after taking a look at the crime scene, he instantly thought of Derek Todd Lee. I mean, come on now. Randy literally lived within spitting distance of Connie Warner. I mean, hell, you could see Connie's house standing at Randy's back door. Not to mention, Derek lived not far from the both of them. So with not much evidence to go off of, McDavid decides to move on a hunch. And he's like, you know what, let's just go check out this Lee guy and see what he's been up to. So they search his home, which he agrees to, and to no avail, they find no evidence in Derek's house. But McDavid did make note that when the investigators got close to searching a closet in Derek's home, he quickly shut down the search and asked them to leave. So, finding no evidence in either of these murders, McDavid decides to circle back to Randy's home the next day to see if they can find anything else. And they luckily do. They found a small pink trash bag outside of Randy's home, right in front of her front door. And at the time, they didn't know the exact importance of this trash bag, but put a pin in this and we'll come back to it later. And as the weeks and months rolled by, the cases got colder and colder. Randy was classified as missing and she was presumed dead. And to this day, her body has still never been found. So later on that year of 1998, McDavid decided to revisit the attack of the young couple in 1992. So he brought Lee down to the station and he put Lee in a lineup. And as soon as Michelle Chapman laid eyes on Lee, she pointed him out without hesitation. She said, "That's him. He's the one that attacked me and my boyfriend that night." So with this information, McDavid tries to get an arrest warrant drawn up. But the judge wasted no time denying it. Because you see, the statutes of limitations of Louisiana were 2 years. And by this time, 2 years had long since passed. So Derek was able to slip through their fingers once again. But for the next couple of years, Derek just kept on with the kept on. And he just couldn't stay out of trouble. He was arrested for robbery, trespassing, more peeping, and even more serious offenses. But on June 1st of 1999, he was charged with stalking a woman named Colette Walker on multiple occasions. And on January 22nd of 2000, while hanging out at a local bar with his side piece Cassandra Green, mind you, he was still married to Jacqueline, but we're not going to talk about that. So this day, Cassandra found him flirting with another woman, and she confronted him about it. But Derek wasn't no kept man, and you wasn't going to tell him who he could and couldn't talk to. So right there in the parking lot, he beat Cassandra's ass. And after beating Cassandra in the parking lot, he tried to escape. But his goofy ass ran into a police deputy's car right in the parking lot before speeding away. Now, thankfully, the officer and Cassandra survived this encounter, but for assaulting his girlfriend and running over a police officer, this violated his probation. But he was only sentenced to 12 stankin' months. But after being released from prison, he said, "Oh yeah, y'all caught me slipping once, but that won't happen again. I'm up. I'm on one." So by this time, he had decided he was going to outsmart the laws. So he migrated his hunting grounds from Zachary to Baton Rouge, and he wasted no time getting straight to business. On September 23rd, 2001, Gina Wilson Green was a 41-year-old nurse who lived in Baton Rouge. She was beautiful, successful, and ambitious. And in the days leading up to her murder, she had this strange feeling that she was being watched. And she just so happened to let her mom and other family members know this as well. But on this night, Derek was hungry, and he needed to feed his compulsion. So, he made his move. He knocked on Gina's door, and when she came to the door, he used his charm. "Good evening, Miss Lady. How you doing? I'm so sorry to disturb you on this lovely evening, but my car broke down a couple blocks away. I seen your lights on, and I was just wondering if I can come in and use your phone and call for a tow truck." And as soon as she's like, "Okay, sure," he forced his way into her apartment, beat her savagely, and strangled her to death. Afterwards, he picked her up and placed her back in her bed and slipped out the door. Her body was discovered 2 days later when she hadn't shown up for work. So her coworker decided to go over to her apartment to check on her, and that's when she was found deceased. No suspects ever turned up, and her case went cold just like the other two. And it didn't take long for Lee to strike again. 4 months later, 21-year-old college student Geraldine DeSoto, who lived in a trailer in the small town of Addis, just west of Baton Rouge. And just like Randy and Gina, she was beautiful, successful, and had her whole life ahead of her. But on the night of January 14th, 2002, Derek came wandering up to Geraldine's trailer while her husband was away. Using his charm and small talk, he weaseled his way inside of her house, and he asked her if he could use her phone. And that same phone that he had just asked to use, he had cracked her upside her skull when she gave it to him. After that initial hit, Geraldine ran to the back bedroom where she knew her husband kept the gun. The two of them wrestled over the gun, and before she knew it, Lee had got control of it. But luckily, Geraldine was able to break away. While trying to make a run for it, she just wasn't fast enough. Lee caught her, he raped her, and he stabbed her over and over again until she was dead. Afterwards, he slipped out just like he had never been there once again, leaving her in the hall of her trailer in a pool of blood for her husband to later find. But during the investigation, detectives found out that Geraldine and her husband had a history of domestic violence, so her husband was the number one suspect for a long time. But 4 months later, on May 31st, 2002, he hit again. This time it was Charlotte, who went by Murray Pace. She was described by her mom as being a funny little curly-headed girl. She was so ambitious and driven. Because y'all listen to this. She graduated from high school when she was only 16 years old, graduated from college when she was 20, and had her MBA by 22. I believe she was the youngest to receive her MBA from LSU. But at the time, she was living with her roommate in a small apartment off Stanford Ave in Baton Rouge. But she had just accepted the job of her dreams working for an accounting firm in Atlanta, and she was due to start her job in the fall. So she was just sticking around working a little job at LSU until she was due to start her new job in the fall. And y'all get this. She lived only 3 houses down from Gina Green. So that night, Murray was at home getting ready for a wedding, and she heard a knock at the door. "Hey ma'am, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I was just wondering if I could use your phone." After forcing his way inside, he attacked her, and you could tell that Charlotte didn't go down without a fight because she had defensive wounds all over her body. And it seemed that her fighting only enraged him further because he beat her even more savagely. And the investigators could tell that he was just angry with her, just mad that she was fighting back, because they found droplets of blood in the bathroom falling straight down in front of the mirror. and the investigators presumed that he held her in front of the mirror to show her what he had done to her. But while she was dying, he raped her, and with the overkill, he used a screwdriver and stabbed her 81 times. She was found later on that night by her roommate. By this time, several bodies had started to pile up in Baton Rouge, and people were scared. Police were on high alert, the media was going crazy, and there was clearly a serial killer on the loose. But it wasn't long before they gave him a name: the Baton Rouge serial killer. I know, nothing special, but he had a name. And it was only after the murder of Murray that the authorities in Baton Rouge started to put the pieces together. Now, with this newest death, and the fact that there were now two victims that lived and were killed so close to one another, all signs were pointing towards this being the same killer. So, this is when a multi agency homicide task force was created. They set up shop in Baton Rouge, and this included Baton Rouge PD, the FBI, the Sheriff's Department, Louisiana State Police, and police from all over the different towns and cities where the previous bodies had disappeared from. This went on to include Zachary, Louisiana, and we couldn't forget about Detective McDavid. Given all of his knowledge and background about the previous murders in Zachary and Baton Rouge, and on top of that, Detective McDavid had this strong feeling that he knew exactly who was committing these crimes. He always had his sights set for Derek, and he knew that he was the one that was responsible for wreaking havoc. So at the time, all of these agents came together, they got involved, they started putting their cases together, all of their evidence, and all of these cases were so similar to one another. However, as much as Detective McDavid wanted to hone in his sights on Derek, according to the eyewitness testimony from the areas where Murray Pace and Gina Green's murders took place, witnesses say they saw somebody in the vicinity that they felt was suspicious and that may have been the killer. And surprisingly enough, they recalled seeing a white man with a white pickup truck, not a black man matching the description of Derek. So right from the beginning, the task force immediately ruled out Derek as a suspect, but McDavid would not let up about asking the task force to reconsider. So because the decision was made to not look into Derek and to create a whole criminal profile that matched a white man, unfortunately, more women would die. But Derek wasn't the only serial killer in this area at the time. You see, there was a man named Sean Vincent Gillis, and Gillis was a white man. He was described to be, the average looking man, stick in the mud kind of, just your normal bland white guy. Nothing spectacular about him at all. He had brown hair, wore it in kind of like a comb over type of look. He had a thick brown mustache, and he had really thick circular glasses. And because most serial killers were typically white men, and all of the victims so far had been white women, and it's said that typically serial killers would keep their kills within the same race. So for those reasons, Derek wasn't even on the task force's radar at the time. And knowing that the police weren't even close to catching him, he just continued his reign. So on July 9th, 2002, Diane Alexander was at home having a peaceful night when out of nowhere she hears a knock at the door. And when she answered it, this man asked to use her telephone, and then he asked if her husband was home. And when she said she wasn't married, he forced his way into her home and began beating her and strangling her with the phone cord. But before he can get to the second phase of his attack, he heard a car pulling into the driveway. This was Diane's son, and realizing that he could potentially be caught, he got himself together and ran out of the back door as soon as he could, just in time for Diane's son to catch him running out the door, so he pursued chase. But Lee got away. He managed to get to his car and drive off. But good thing Diane's son did manage to get a good look at his car. And it's said that Diane Alexander is the only survivor of Derek. And sadly, he would continue to strike. And it would only take him 3 days to hit again. 44-year-old Pamela Kennemore owned a little antique shop in Denham Springs, Louisiana. She was successful, beautiful, strong, passionate, all the things that Derek hated in a woman. So for days, he watched her every move, all without her ever even noticing. And on the night of July 12th, 2002, only 3 days after his attack on Diane, Lee followed Pam home. And unfortunately and coincidentally, that night she accidentally left her keys in the door, making entrance into her home that much easier for Derek. So while she's settling in, running her bath water, getting comfortable for the evening, he waited until she was fully unclothed and naked to ambush her. He attacked her and drug her from her home, leaving nothing behind but a couple droplets of blood on her living room rug. Now, several witnesses did say they saw a vehicle driving erratically away from the home, and a witness even tried to call the police, but they were unable to locate him even with the partial license plate. So with that, he took Pam to a wooded area by Whiskey Bay, about 35 miles outside of Baton Rouge. He beat her, raped her, stabbed her, and then finished her off by cutting her throat so deep that it nearly took her head off. Her body was discovered by some fishermen 4 days later on July 16th. And although her body was pretty badly decomposed, luckily investigators were able to get some DNA from her rape kit. And by this time, all of Baton Rouge was on edge. Women were starting to buy guns, tasers, taking self-defense classes, and most importantly, they wanted this killer to be brought to justice. Pam's family wanted the killer to be caught so badly that they used their own money to post a billboard in Baton Rouge calling for justice for their daughter and for the other victims as well. They even went ahead and offered a $75,000 reward for any information that could lead to the arrest and conviction of whoever took Pam from them. And just 6 days later, Diane Alexander was able to describe what Lee looked like to police, so they called in a sketch artist. She described him as being an African American man with a round face, short hair, a large forehead, and had the wild buckshot eyes of a demon. So finally, a sketch was released to the public for everybody to see. However, nothing initially came of it. And why, do you ask? Well, because he was a black man. And no matter how much Detective McDavid protested, the task force was still stuck on this being a white man. And because of that, 2 more women's lives were taken. As police kept their sights on every white man in a white pickup truck, the fall month of November crept in, and with that came another body. So far as I mentioned, every victim had been white, and until this night on November 21st, 2002 in Lafayette, Louisiana, this was about 50 miles outside of Baton Rouge, 23-year-old Trenisha Danae Colomb was the first and only black victim of the Baton Rouge serial killer. But she was a member of the United States Armed Forces, and she had dreams of becoming a Marine. She had just recently lost her mom, and she was still heavily grieving, so much so that she visited her grave every single day. And on this night, she was out at the cemetery alone when Lee crept up on her and attacked her without hesitation. He dragged her to a nearby wooded area, raped her, and then beat her before ending her life by bashing her face in with a tree branch. When her body was finally discovered, everything about the scene was telling the investigators that this was the same killer. It had to be. And the DNA from the scene also confirmed their suspicions. This was the same DNA from Pam's attack, but still they didn't have a face or a name to go with the DNA. So 4 months later, on March 13th, 2003, Lee took his last victim's life. This was 26-year-old Carrie Lynn Yoder. She was a grad student at LSU. She was getting her PhD in marine biology, and she lived alone in a little apartment close to campus. So on this night, as she unloaded groceries and put them in the house, as she grabbed her last bag of groceries, Lee forced his way inside, knocked her around the apartment, kidnapped her. He put her in the back of his car and just drove away. Her body wasn't found until 10 days later in the Whiskey Bay area, the same area where Pam's body was found. She had been raped, beaten, and strangled to death. So at this time, ugly-ass, turd-face, broke, desperate-ass Derek Todd Lee had taken the lives of 7 women. They were all beautiful, strong, independent, successful, and thanks to the DNA he left behind on Carrie Yoder's body, they were able to send it off to the lab for ancestral testing. And to many people's surprise, when they got the results back, they did not show the ancestral DNA results for a white person. In fact, these were the results of an 85% African American man. And this flipped the whole investigation on its head. And finally, the investigators opened their eyes to other possibilities for suspects. So for this, a press conference was held, and police were just so embarrassed because they had to admit that they were wrong and that they were now looking for a black man. So at this point, flyers of the newest police sketch were now hitting the media. The streets, the billboards, everybody was now seeing this new sketch. And on May 25th, 2003, the task force finally decided to take McDavid seriously on his suspicions of Lee. And they got a warrant to collect his DNA so that they can test it against the crime scene DNA. And would you know it, McDavid was the officer knocking on the door as loud as can be, looking Derek right in the face, telling him that he's there to collect a swab from him. After collecting and sending his sample off to the lab, it took 3 long weeks to get back results. And when the results came in, the DNA was a match to none other than Derek Todd Lee, who we now know has been the Baton Rouge serial killer this whole time, responsible for the deaths of Gina Wilson Green, Charlotte Murray Pace, Pamela Kennemore, Trenisha Colomb, and Carrie Lynn Yoder. The police finally had their guy. But when they go look for him to make their arrest, this man is nowhere to be found. He's already 500 miles away. You see, immediately after the police came to get that swab, he wasted no time jumping in the car and he bonked out to Atlanta. But thankfully, it didn't take police long to track him down. And y'all, guess where they found him? He was walking down the street near a college campus. Probably looking for his next victim. But he was quickly apprehended and arrested and extradited back to Louisiana. And of course, after his arrest, they wasted no time searching all of this man's belongings and his home. And it was a gold mine. This man was actually dumb enough to hold on to the victim's cell phones and their car keys. I guess he wanted to keep them for memories. But when he was later interrogated, he said nothing. And no matter how much they brought to the table against him, he still was tight-lipped. He wasn't saying nothing. But none of that mattered because their nail in the coffin was his DNA. And that's all that really mattered. But to put the icing on top of the cake, his DNA got another hit. Because you see, some DNA samples were collected from Geraldine DeSoto, and some of his skin was found underneath her nails. So finally, years later, Geraldine's husband was officially cleared of suspicion of her murder. And y'all remember that little pink trash bag that was left in front of Randy's house that I told y'all we were going to come back to? Well, Derek's dirty ass semen was also found in that trash bag. So just more DNA piling up to get more convictions. So with everything being said, and all of the victims now being connected to him, the prosecutors wanted to try him separately for each individual murder. So in August of 2004, he had his first trial for the murder of Geraldine DeSoto. And of course, his defense tried to rule him incompetent to stand trial because he was insane and he was retarded and had an IQ below 70. And they were trying to argue that he was so slow and mentally incapable that he had no way of determining that he was wrong. But the prosecution's like, come on now, be for real. And they proceeded to rip that argument to shreds, arguing that, yeah, he may not be intellectually all that there, but he had plenty of street smarts. He had the ability to work and live a normal life. And he was clearly smart enough to plan every single one of these murders. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew how to be charming enough to get into these women's homes, how to ask for what he needed. Not to mention, he was smart enough to kill them and dispose of their bodies. But for this, they were only able to get him for second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But y'all, like I said, they wanted to try him individually, so the prosecutors weren't done with him. So the following month of September of 2004, he went to trial for Charlotte Murray Pace's murder. And this time, he was being charged with capital murder, and they were absolutely seeking the death penalty. And on October 12th, 2004, the jury returned with their verdict after only 19 minutes of deliberating, and they determined that Derek Todd Lee was guilty and he should die. So, he spent 12 years on death row in Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, Louisiana, and that whole time he never said a word about anything. He had no remorse, he never apologized, nothing. But after spending 12 years on death row, he started to have some heart problems. So much so that the state even decided to waste money on him and give him a heart pacer. But eventually, he was taken to the hospital for heart disease, and on January 21st, 2016, at the age of 47, he died. This literally always happens. I promise you, God be knowing. Y'all cannot just go around killing his people and think that you're not going to pay the price for it. God's going to always get his lick back. He's going to always have the final word. And it's always proven in these cases, right? But y'all, all of these women were beautiful, intelligent, and all of their murders were very much so deliberate. Because on April 6, 1998, Derek just so happened to lose his job. Then, 2 days later, he killed Randy. And then on January 11, 2002, he lost another job. Then 3 days later, he killed Geraldine. Then, on November 18th, 2002, he filed for bankruptcy. And you know what? 3 days later, he killed Tranisha. So, all of these were deliberate. He knew what he was doing, and he was just an angry man that didn't like strong, independent women. He wanted to be in control, and whenever they tried to fight back, that just made him even angrier. But y'all, that's the end of this week's case. I hope y'all enjoyed this episode on the Baton Rouge serial killer. And as usual, I'll see y'all back here, same place, same time next week.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.